Coming back
Correct.
to the question, I guess you remember it better than I do. So what would you reply to that?
So if you look across the different space agencies, we actually see that everyone shares the concerns. I mean, it's very obvious that we have quite significant problems to address. And so if you look at ESA or NASA or also others that are funded by public money, of course, they have to address those problems when it comes to climate change. And so we have all those Earth observation missions that are being funded, many of them already flying, and a lot of them in the pipeline being developed and being put up, not only in the US, Europe, there's also India, Japan, you can name all of them. So everyone does this. Plus there's a growing, let's say, field in the commercial sector or private companies, let's say, who also address various aspects, like, for instance, monitoring forest fires or monitoring the oceans or earthquakes. And so I think this is happening. This is a good thing, but we also have still asked the question, how much data are we collecting and how much of it is actually what we need to implement action that is required to address those problems. So for me, it seems like those two things are still not entirely put together. Let's say space programs are driven just by those arguments that we have to put missions up there to monitor certain things. But then if you ask the questions, but what is then happening in reality? This is the next point. Then second, the narratives for space exploration are still very strong, and I think they are also increasing in the sense that there's a few billionaires, let's say, who tell us their visions that they took from others, from the early space pioneers, let's say, or those who even lived before the space era or before we even went into space. And these are, for instance, the colonization of Mars that is promoted by Elon Musk quite heavily, or also to build giant structures in space, these so-called O'Neill spheres, which is a concept that Jeff Bezos, for instance, is promoting, like having huge habitats of Earth where we will have conditions of Maui every day, let's say. This is what he said. And
meanwhile, sacrificing Maui.
Why? Yes, exactly. And the same thing goes for Mars too, because the argument is that here on Earth we might suffer a nuclear war or being killed by robots of some rogue AIs. But then why are you developing AIs in first place? And second is if we fear nukes, then why this argument of having 10,000 of nukes to terraform Mars? So there are all these contradictions that are coming together. But these narratives are very strong because they are somehow multiplied a lot. And many people believe that this will be a good thing because it somehow comes with some stronger link to, I don't know, salvation, let's say. So humanity will finally solve the problem of extinction, let's say, that is threatening us. And there are basically these individuals who are there to save us. And if you start criticizing this, it's like you're criticizing maybe Jesus, I don't know. Who also came
Blasphemy,
there.
yeah, blasphemy. Any criticism towards the predominant, business model is seemingly always considered blasphemous. But what I witness is usually the combination of two things. I mean, of course, more than two things, but usually you can boil it down. One is we always use these kind of old images of the future, used images of the future, used futures, this kind of hauntology, like where the past is still haunting us, and we don't seem to be able to create something new. Although I think we love novelty, I think we also love a lot the comfort of the familiar. And the other thing is the Yeah, well, how can I describe that? I lost a little bit of train of thought. Um, the the yeah, the lack of daring to think outside of the box and to even be outside of the box. Like there's this business model, or the contemporary type of civilization is a very expensive model, and I mean here expensive with a. But we don't seem to be able to evolve and develop and establish a form that is maybe more reductive. So with less focusing on um, the different modality. And I think you can see it in every industry. We know from, I mean, the Club of Rome, and even earlier, the Silent Spring, the type of environmental movement that pointed out that if we continue on that kind of trajectory, on that kind of timeline, we will not be able to solve the problems we are creating. So what I mean by that is there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in all of that. And I was wondering, is your industry aware of these two things, self-fulfilling prophecy and the type of being stuck and hooked on used images of the future?
Yeah, from my point of view, or from what I see, what is being projected, I think all the major space agencies, and also probably the majority of people, continue on that, let's say, infinite growth idea. That's also the case for ESA, for instance. We want to grow the space economy, we want to commercialize there. So it's basically building upon all these stories that basically mainstream economy is building on. So it's like you identified that, or you found out, okay, growth is actually a problem because it comes with all those problems. But then someone like Jeff Bezos appears and says, we just solve it by going into space, because then we can continue growing infinitely, because space is just so huge. But from my point of view, it's still possible also to imagine futures that are not necessarily relying on growth, because I also see how many problems this has, despite not being a workable solution, let's say, on a finite planet to continue being on that growth trajectory, let's say. So, but in that context, also, if you think of space, one of the major lessons for me when I was looking at space history, for instance, and you mentioned also that narratives, let's say, from others are being taken, futures from those who created them, let's say, in the early 20th century. If you think of Tsiolkovsky, for instance, or Werner von Braun, what those people didn't know back then, because no one went out to space, they didn't know what the conditions on Venus or Mars are like. People back then still believed that we can just go to that planet, to those planets, maybe at some point, and even live there. So conditions might be very friendly. But then what actually happened is, once we went there, we found out quite the opposite, that those are very hostile environments. I mean, the moon is super hostile to life, and so is Venus, and so is Mars. So what happened actually in the space era is that we were actively debunking all those narratives by showing that the only livable habitat is for trillions of kilometers around our planet is our planet. This is where the concept of oasis Earth, for instance, evolved. And I find this quite striking, that those narratives of Werner von Braun or Gerard O'Neill or also Tsiolkovsky, they continue to live in those billionaires' visions, even though we should have a revision of what we actually learned in those years of spaceflight activity, that there's actually like only one place where we belong to and can live self-sufficiently. And this would help us maybe to develop also narratives of potential futures where maybe people can start imagining life or systems that don't necessarily grow, but maybe are sustainable. And sustainable is then a word that we also love using, but somehow it's also linked still to infinite growth. And that's where I see the problem.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But I like the idea of that we actually have already a history of debunking these kind of narratives, and that we somehow, but although we have debunked a few, and I think we're still doing that, we somehow lack the translation to then change course. I mean, even something like, if you consider something like autophagy, I hope I pronounced it right. There was a Nobel Prize for that, I think, in 2016, like basically intermittent fasting. So meaning that if you don't eat, that can be actually healthier for your body than if you eat. So and coming from those new insights into how life works, are there what I'm just curious to find out what kind of attempts are there to actually look beyond the current business model, to look beyond and the current narratives, the current direction. What is the amount of energy being invested in actually alternating this type of reality we are now still stuck with, and embracing new forms of reality, so to say?
Yeah, I have to admit that I'm lacking any of such perspectives in the space sector, let's say. Or I would actually love to get in touch with people who have such visions, let's say. For me, it rather seems as if the space sector itself is like reliant on these, let's say, mainstream models. Because in the end, if you want to do spaceflight, you need a heavily industrialized society. You need to have high technology. So you need to do all of this. You need to do a lot of mining. You need to be able of producing a lot of energy to basically sustain spaceflight activities. So in some sense, I see how the space sector itself maybe cannot even be sustainable in that sense, or cannot be decoupled from that narrative. And in the end, so if you want to imagine something else, maybe one step would be to allow scenarios where there would not be space. Maybe try to imagine how we could live maybe without space. In the end, what I think, this is what gives me basically also some, let's say, or let's put it that way, if you tell it to those people, to some people who are also enthusiastic about spaceflight, they will always say, you put us back into the Stone Age immediately, because we all have this, again, narratives of how Stone Age people were very primitive, and probably there was some development ongoing.
But here, if you allow me to interfere here, because to interrupt, because there's something interesting what you just said regarding again, also like, the argumentation that any rethinking of the essential and whole concept might put us into whatever Stone Age or something like that. But interestingly, though, if we even consider something like going to Mars, obviously traveling in the traditional way would put any human at risk, right, with the radiation that you are exposed to. So therefore, even the idea of traveling to another place in terms of space might be something that we really have to rethink, right? Maybe traveling has not to be the type of traveling that we are used to right now in the traditional way, and the technological advancement, or this technological disruption, would be to rethink that kind of concept completely. And so traveling in a very different, counterintuitive way. So I'm thinking that's for me very important, and I'm wondering what is invested into that kind of thinking, right? Because we are obviously all socialized in the form of fabric learning, right, through the industrial model. So we need to know the one direction, march into one direction, have to have the right, correct answer. But we live now in a very different world. So this kind of thinking and the type of education we are now accustomed to is not serving us anymore to work on those complex phenomena and issues. And I'm thinking, obviously, you probably can't teach an old dog new tricks. So we are all somehow stuck with what we are now used to. But still, there needs to be a tremendous amount of investment in terms of energy to actually disrupt that type of thinking. So I'm just curious, what kind of voices are really offering these type of insights in your industry? Because obviously there's a hierarchical model and organizational cultures, and as you mentioned, it might look bad, or someone might look bad questioning these kind of things. Everyone is not questioning anymore. But where are the voices that really are eye-opening and like doing the blasphemous speech?
I'm also wondering, Daniel, because I don't hear them that often. So yeah, it's maybe a bit of a sobering reply right now. But I agree with you. I would dedicate much more resources probably to processes or structures that we can bring up that allow people to think more creatively. Those kind of things on a very much systemic level. Like if you mentioned, for instance, traveling, if it was interplanetary travel, also to trying to imagine what could be possible. And then you have to link it maybe with those who understand technology and how it could work in that direction. But this is something also difficult. For instance, if you see that there's Star Trek and there's maybe a warp drive, and then you try to think of it, how it might work in practice, or maybe it doesn't. No one will be able to tell you. And then how do you get maybe to that vision? Is it achievable or basically impossible? But that's all good questions. But what I like in general is that people engage with those thoughts, and that these things are also covered in, let's say, popular culture, for instance.
Apart from your daily routines to monitor and mitigate the whole space field, I'm just curious to find out, like, what do you have some kind of crazy visions for the future? Do you have some kind of insane lunatic ideas that you actually like and prefer and somehow cherish? Is there something you would like to reveal that you find intriguing and fascinating that is not part of your daily routine, so to say?
I always keep saying to many colleagues of mine that we just maybe abandon space flight and then have more campfires again, because we save a lot of time as we don't have to deal with space debris any longer. But this is somehow not very much engaging to a lot of people, it seems. So if you ask if that's insane, then people might think of this idea of being insane, because there's nothing like, supporting this very expansive, again, ideas of putting something up in space. But maybe to give you, so if the need is there to identify something quite encouraging, one positive example to some extent is if we look at the International Space Station, for instance. It is a quite international project where US and Russians even think of the geopolitical conflict that we have right now, but they docked their modules up there and they are operating the space station together with the Japanese and the Europeans, Canadians. And so it's like a shining star, let's say, up there for international cooperation or what's possible in the globalized world. And I think there are such good examples where spaceflight basically allows to remove borders, let's say. Astronauts report from space that they see the Earth without borders. These are all things that do inspire me. So I love those stories when they report them. When they see, for instance, the very thin atmosphere up there. And somehow I think they are collecting already those bits and pieces that could maybe serve a narrative where we start being more stewards of and protecting basically the Earth that we inhabit together with many other species. So I think in some way there's a lot of tiny things. That's not like a flagship project or let's say space station or space mission that I would highlight here. But this general idea of, you know, you go out to space, and this is what many astronauts did. You turn around and then you see suddenly this marble, this blue earth out there, and you realize it's your only home, and you can cover it with one hand, and then you don't see it anymore against all the black of the universe behind. And this is quite impressive. So this is where I gather a lot of hope, let's say, for stories that help us to understand each other, and then maybe actively developing, let's say, more peace on this planet, not only between humans or different human cultures, but also with the planet itself.
Yeah, I very much love the puzzle pieces you basically laid out right now, and I don't think that campfire in itself is a bad idea at all. I think it's even a very progressive idea, because then we are coming back to where it all began. That's one thing, right? Storytelling near campfire, near fireplace, so to say. And also what I hear is also this need for rituals and for ritualization that really brings back our focus and attention to what is really about life itself, and a refocus, so to say, in a certain way. I like that too a lot. And obviously the idea Earth without borders, I mean, super intriguing. And I think in a certain way, people are already there, I would assume. But obviously we still have infrastructure and systems and governments that cannot get over their past narratives, as we are witnessing now, to our tremendous despair. Regarding and the pale blue dot story, right? The thin atmosphere that we need to steward, that we need to protect, that we need to safeguard, and regarding also the changes in atmospheric compositions that are related to our activities of cutting trees and then creating the rockets that allegedly are supposed to save us from a future that we are creating ourselves. I mean, it's something where indeed this debunking has to continue, and reflections and new narratives and old narratives have to come together and align our thinking in a way that also serves and is being translated into behavioral patterns and actions, because we lack the alternatives. We might all be able to somehow theorize a better world that is peaceful, but somehow we cannot translate it into activities and actions that reflect our daily routines, or that offers something else than what we are used to nowadays. I love that all. And I very much cherish the insights you provide. And if I may, maybe with the last question, also offer you the opportunity to end our conversation in a very eloquent way. What is your outlook personally, and what do you want to see happening in your field? And if you have the chance to say something about that, what would you like to change and see being changed?
So I have 2 kids. They are now 8 and 11 years old. And if you are a father, you're basically also imagining a future for them, let's say. So this is something that is quite emotional for oneself, and let's say a positive experience I made to try to imagine how the future might be also with them, as we're talking futures here. And I think what I'm trying to imagine for them is, as you just mentioned with the campfire, that we might come back to have such rituals together. Maybe things will happen on a more local level again, rather than let's say the globalized path. You see this in other areas like food supplies, for instance, where there are strong incentives to focus more on regional or local foods. And maybe this happens with other things too, like transportation, but also you start engaging more again with your local communities, which also suffered a lot, I think, because people, rather than going to the clubs or the local clubs to support them, went maybe to play online and do all this kind of stuff, you know, where people became more, let's say, isolated rather than growing as a community. And this is something that I would find interesting. And I'm also trying to find a way, for instance, to engage with my kids. For instance, we are here around in this area, trying to see what we can do in this region together. And for me, this is a good outlook, for instance. But how does this all include space? So for space, I would probably think that a good outcome for us could be if it would support this, if indeed we would use space systems to improve the conditions for communities here on ground. And if we find a way basically to stronger focus on those things that we value, rather than maybe those that are rather harmful or destructive to all of us.
Indeed, absolutely. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I mean, it's always wonderful to hear your insights and hear you talking from such a rich experience and knowledge base. It's quite impressive and yeah, super enjoyable. And I'm very much looking forward to eventually to the next Space Debris conference, if there's one.
Yes, we'll have one.
That's great. That's amazing. Yeah, thank you so much.
It was
Very
also
nice.
a pleasure on my side, Daniel. Thank you very much for having me.
Lovely, lovely.